here for Ibogaine Insights. It's a series from Beond to help practitioners and professionals understand the benefits of psychedelic-assisted therapy for the treatment of addiction and trauma. It's a bi-weekly expert discussion bringing together authorities in addiction medicine and experts in other therapies to discuss innovation in therapy for trauma and addiction. And we welcome you, Gabor Maté, to this event. Thank you so much for being here today. I apologize for the little bit of a technical difficulty getting started, but I guess we're still in 2021 here in California. Gabor Maté is a retired physician who, after 20 years of family practice and palliative care experience, worked for over a decade in Vancouver's downtown East Side with patients challenged by drug addiction and mental illness. He's a best-selling author of 4 books, published in 27 languages. Gabor is internationally renowned speaker, highly sought after for his expertise in addiction, trauma, childhood development, and the relationship of stress and illness. His book on addiction received the Hubert Evans Prize for Literary Nonfiction. Gabor, welcome to Beond and welcome to Ibogaine Insights.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Should I just speak for a while and then take questions, or how do you want to do this?
Well, what we're here really to talk about, I have a few thoughts to kick us off, and I'd love to share those with you. But okay. Of course, I know that I've seen many of your talks, and I'm grateful to be here with you, as I know our 250 attendants are as well. But we want to talk a little bit about where we are right now in the timeline, in the history of addiction, looking at it through your experience. What is different in terms of, first, the scope and scale of the particularly opioid addiction and overdose epidemic, which is killing hundreds of people per day of fatal overdose. Why is it getting worse so fast? And why aren't treatment options that are effective available? And we'll get into some of the other innovations that psychedelic-assisted therapies represent, including but not limited to Ibogaine.
Okay, so first of all, I think it's narrowing of the focus to speak only about opiates when it comes to addiction. So that just last week there was a report, United States, the number of people dying of alcohol-related diseases went up by 25% to nearly 100,000, which is pretty much as the opiate crisis is killing. So when we talk about addiction, to restrict it to opiates is actually to miss a large spectrum of addictions that are causing illness, dysfunction, havoc, personal tragedy. So for me, addiction is not related to any particular substance. That's the first point. The second point is to understand why addictions of all kinds, from substances to self-harming behaviors, including self-cutting for that matter, but other forms of, pornography, internet, gambling, why are all these rising? We have to discard the two mainstream views of addiction, discard them as either utter nonsense or at the very best inadequate. Utter nonsense is the common belief that addictions are choices that people make. There has to be some reason. If it's a choice, why are more and more people choosing it? Well, I'm not even going to spend time on the choice model because it's got no scientific buttress whatsoever, but it's the one that dominates the social attitudes towards addiction, including the legal system, which is all based on it. People are making this choice, they need to be punished for it. I'll throw it aside as worthless and just inhumane. The mainstream treatment model, the medical model, is that it's a brain disease largely potentiated by genetics. which again does nothing to explain why it's rising, because genes don't change in 5 or 10 years, 20 years, or even 100 years. Mm-hmm. So then, before we can understand why are we seeing more addiction, we have to understand what is addiction? What do we mean by it? So I'm going to give you a definition, if I may, that I think is impeccable and all-inclusive. So I define addiction as manifested in any behavior, and the emphasis is on the word any, that a person finds temporary pleasure in or relief and therefore craves, but suffers negative consequences as a result of, and is unable to give it up despite negative consequences. So pleasure, relief, craving in the short term, negative harm in the long term, inability to give it up. As soon as we get that, we see that addictions don't only encompass substances, but also behaviors like eating, like shopping, like self-cutting, like gambling, like pornography, like the internet, like video gaming, like gambling, like shopping, like work, like anything. So that's the first essential point, just to just define this phenomenon. Number one. Number two, we have to understand what it's really all about. And once we understand it's about, we can see why it's rising. So, Valdi, I know there's a chat line here, so I'm going to ask the participants now. First of all, just ask yourself if, according to my definition, you've recognized in yourself any addictive patterns at any time in your life. In other words, behavior that you found relief in, pleasure, craving, harm, had a hard time giving it up. Okay, if you've identified that yourself, and
Gabor, I just have to ask you, are you looking at the chat on the right? Do you see what's happening?
Yeah, like the chat.
Yes, flood of affirmation.
Got it. All right. Then I'm going to ask you my next question. And I'm going to ask some of you on the chat who are willing to say, not what you were addicted to, not when, and not what was wrong with it. I'm going to ask you what was right about it. What did it give you? What did it provide you in the long term? What did it provide you in the short term that you craved, wanted, believed you couldn't do without? Okay, control.
Relief. Escape. Pleasure. Soothing. These are words that are coming up.
Love. Happy. Relief from suffering. Okay, let's stop there, okay?
Distraction.
Thank you.
Good question.
When you say distraction and escape, from what?
Yeah.
Because only people who are suffering need distraction or escape. Otherwise, they're very happy to be present. In other words, pleasure, pain relief, stress relief, connection, control, are these good things, people, or are they bad things? They're good things. The things we all want, these are qualities we all crave as human beings. In other words, the addiction is not your primary problem, and it's not a disease either. It's your attempt to solve the problem. The problem of lack of control, the problem of emotional pain, the problem of stress you can't handle, the problem that pleasure has been drained out of your life, the problem of lack of connection. In other words, the addiction is an attempt to solve a problem. Now, if we want to understand why you had the problem, we need to look at not at your genes and not at your brain scans, but at your life. Something happened to you that deprived you of your capacity for pleasure. On God's green earth, with all that it has to offer and give us, you had no pleasure. 7 billion people in the world, and you had no connection. All the help that's available, and you had no escape from distress. Something happened. Mm-hmm. That something that happened is trauma.
Well,
so what I'm saying is that the addiction is really your attempt to solve the problem of trauma. Now, why are we seeing more and more of it? Because for reasons that I go into deeply in my next book, The Myth of Normal, the world is increasingly traumatizing more and more people. That's an aspect of our culture. That's why we're seeing more of it. For example, the opioid crisis is completely connected to the social dislocation caused by the hollowing out of the industrial working class.
Yes.
And its sense of meaning and belonging, connection and value. So these have been called deaths of despair. But where does that despair come from? So that's why we're seeing more of it.
So it's so interesting because there's a trauma or a suffering, a disconnection that people are experiencing. What you're saying is it doesn't matter if we're talking about pills or heroin or meth or cocaine or alcohol. We're talking about the same the same desired outcome, which is relief from that suffering.
And also with pornography and also with sexual addiction.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
So the behaviors.
So that's the first point I'm making. The second one I'm making in response to what you just said is that even if you look at the brain circuitry of addiction, it's the same circuits that are involved in all addiction.
Regardless of whether there's a substance involved.
Sorry?
Regardless of whether there's a substance, it's the same circuitry, whether it's the pleasure of video gaming.
It's the same circuitry. So what is the circuitry? Now, if we really want to understand addiction, we need to look at the brain a little bit. So first of all, we have the opiates directly go to the endorphin circuitry. But the only reason that the opiates work on the endorphin circuitry, the endorphins being our own endogenous opiates, is because we have endorphin receptors in our bodies. We have our own internal opiates. So why do we have them? So what is the biological evolutionary role of the endorphin system in the human brain and body? Well, they play many functions in the gut. They regulate gut motion in the mucous membranes. In the brain, they provide pain relief, not just physical pain relief, but emotional pain relief, because the suffering of physical pain is experienced in the same part of the brain as the suffering of emotional pain. So pain relief, number one, which we have to have in order to live.
Right.
Number one. Number two, they provide the experience of pleasure and reward and elation and joy. Now imagine life without that.
Well, that sounds like the life of the person that is seeking the relief, right? They're suffering. That is what it's like without that joy. A continual search and suffer. And
furthermore, they give us one of the most important thing in life, which happens to be a little thing called love, because the endorphins play a significant role in the attachment circuitry that connects the infant to their caregivers and the caregivers to the infant. So if you take infant mice and you knock out their endorphin receptors genetically in the laboratory, these little mice will not cry for their mothers on separation. What will that mean in the wild? They're deaf.
Yes.
So that's how important the endorphin circuitry is. So when you talk to opiate addicts and you ask them, well, what does it do for you? You know what they'll tell you? One of my patients, I worked in downtown east side of Vancouver, North America's most heavy area of drug use. And I was working at North America's first supervised injection site. And I asked this big guy, I said, well, what does the heroin do for you? And he said, Doc, I don't know how to put into words, but it's like you're 3 years old, you're shivering with a fever. Your mom puts you on her lap, wraps you in a warm blanket, and gives you warm chicken soup. That's what the heroin feels like. Okay, now, just how are we going to do without that? That's the first point.
Yeah.
Then there's the dopamine circuitry. Now, dopamine is an essential brain chemical. There's a system in our brain for seeking, for exploration, and that runs on dopamine. So dopamine creates vitality, a sense of curiosity, engagement, excitement. And all addicts, whether they're pornography addicts or sex addicts or crystal meth addicts, they're looking for that hit of dopamine, without which we don't feel alive. So the addict just wants to feel alive. There's a reason why he doesn't feel alive, but he wants to feel alive. Now, that's the second circuitry. Then there's the third circuitry, which is stress regulation. I mean, we do have a stress response system, which helps us survive. But if it gets overwhelmed and it's not down-regulated, then we're out of control. Right. Addictions help to regulate stress for people, as people have said in the chat line. And then number 4, we have the impulse regulation circuitry, which tells us, okay, you may want this thing, but it's not good for you, don't do it. Now, addicts, as somebody said, addicts don't have good impulse regulation. And in a minute, I'm going to tell you why not. But as somebody said, the problem in addiction is not lack of a free will, but lack of a free won't. The impulse regulation in the orbitofrontal cortex just doesn't work. Now, why not? And if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'm going to read you from an article from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, which is the world's most prestigious child developmental study organization. The article appeared in the journal Pediatrics, which is the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And I'm going to quote you 2 sentences. How does the brain actually develop? Like, if we're going to talk about brain diseases or brain conditions, shouldn't we at least look at what happens to the brain? How does it actually develop?
How does it develop successfully? But before we look at it, like get it back there.
Exactly. So here's what the article says, 2 sentences. The architecture of the brain is constructed to an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood. Now notice that begins before birth, which means already that stress is put on pregnant women can predispose children to addiction later on. That's shown in the laboratory, okay? The architecture of the brain is constructed to an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follow. That's the first sentence. The second sentence is, the interactions of genes and experiences literally shapes the circuitry of the developing brain and is critically influenced by the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships, particularly in the early childhood years. In other words, the brain develops physiologically, and its neurotransmitters and the receptors for them develop in interaction with the emotional environment. And you can predict that depressed mothers, their children will have fewer dopamine receptors. And mothers who are stressed during pregnancy, those children will have fewer dopamine receptors. Now they'll be more likely to do dopamine. You can stress animals in the laboratory during pregnancy. Their offspring were more likely to use cocaine and alcohol to soothe themselves as adults. In other words, not only is the pain that people are trying to soothe or escape from, not only is the disconnection, not only is the stress, not only is the loss of control and loss of vitality related to early trauma, the brain itself is impaired by early trauma.
It's an injury, an injured organ.
Well, it's an organ that didn't develop the way it should because the right conditions were not available for its proper development, which means for treatment of addiction, and this is where psychedelics also come in, it's not enough to deal with the behavior, which is what most treatment programs do. Right. That's a shallow approach. The behavior is only a symptom. The addiction itself is only a symptom.
Yeah.
It's a symptom of a traumatic injury. And if we don't set out to heal that trauma, which we can, fortunately, and fortunately, the brain can grow or develop, it's got its capacity called neuroplasticity, well documented, but we have to provide the right conditions. And for those, because like any development requires the right conditions. So the question is, how can we in our treatment program address the real issue, not just the presenting issue? And how can we also create conditions in which people can develop new brain circuits so that they don't have to live life according to these old patterns? That's the deal.
Thank you for that. So we have this crisis of addiction that spans not just substances, but behaviors that we're facing. The treatment solutions are far outpacing the conventional treatment methods are far outpacing the scope of the epidemic. In your experience, when you think about psychedelics, and specifically the ones that are used for the treatment of addiction, what is your outlook on the benefit of this innovation, specifically related to Ibogaine?
All right. So first of all, everything works in context. So it doesn't matter which psychedelic we're talking about. We have to talk about the context. So it's not see, Western medicine, you see, you go to a physician with depression, they'll tell you you like serotonin, here's Prozac that'll elevate your serotonin levels. It might even work too, symptomatically, but it's just about the substance. Why are you depressed? What happened in your life? Usually you're not asked that question. Now, when it comes to the psychedelics, it's not just here's this biological entity that's going to change your brain. It's about context, short-term context and long-term context. That's the first point. Second point, Ibogaine's got some particularly unique qualities, which I'll mention in a moment, but I've worked with psilocybin, and that's being studied now for stimulant addictions and smoking cessation. I worked with MDMA. I've worked with ayahuasca. And I've seen people give up addictions with the aid of these psychedelics all across the board. Now, what's unique about Ibogaine is that it not only allows you to tap into the trauma and to deal with it. I can talk about why it does that, or why they all do it actually. But Ibogaine also has the special quality of obviating opiate withdrawal. So I've seen people after 20 years of heroin habit do an Ibogaine treatment, and within 2 days they have no withdrawal symptoms. They don't have to go on Suboxone, they don't have to go on methadone. They just don't have withdrawal symptoms for a good long time.
Why is that?
Well, it seems to have a special quality of somehow affecting the endorphin system. Mm-hmm. I don't truly understand the science of it, but it's been well documented. And now it also has the quality of helping people deal with trauma, which is different, but only Ibogaine of all the psychedelic substances can actually cut short or really literally eliminate the withdrawal symptoms of opiates.
And I think the point is obvious, but I'd love your perspective on the relationship between the withdrawal symptoms and the willingness for someone to initiate treatment. Obviously, there's a direct relationship between the feeling dope sick, as it may be called, and willingness to get treatment without the option of Ibogaine or something that works similarly. But for now, all we know is Ibogaine in this case. To address the withdrawal symptoms, it seems that treatment is going to consistently be inadequate to address the withdrawal.
Well, so right now what we do, right now medically what we do with opiate addicts is at best we addict them to some other substance, because methadone is highly addictive. Suboxone creates dependence. There was this belief in the beginning when Suboxone was introduced a decade or so ago or more, that somehow it's going to treat addiction, but it doesn't treat the addiction. It does something useful. It gets somebody hooked on a manageable substance that isn't going to give you HIV and ruin your liver and all this, So
it's harm reduction.
It's harm reduction, but it's not a treatment for the addiction as such.
Agreed.
Not as such. You're still addicted and you're still dependent. So Ibogaine, which lasts in the system for several months, keeps you from going through a withdrawal. Now, that doesn't mean that therefore you're now all okay, because there was a reason why I used the opiates in the first place. And that reason is trauma. So that trauma still needs to be addressed. So the Ibogaine experience in the right hands also addresses the trauma. So Ibogaine deals with both aspects of it, both the physiological withdrawal, but also the traumatic imprint.
Agreed. So this is the purpose of our discussion, and our entire biweekly panel series is to recognize that most addiction specialists don't get trained in trauma, as you've written extensively about. They may make it through their entire medical training without hearing the word trauma. But new therapists, psychologists are very interested in psychedelic assisted therapies. And if they're focused on addiction and its root trauma, what could you tell them about Ibogaine as a tool that they may be interested in better understanding, better utilizing safely as a way of helping people? This is precisely why we're here, and what Beond stands for is to help therapists understand the tool and help clients find the treatment that works.
Okay, well, first of all, I tell them the potential of Ibogaine, just as I outlined it, as you and I have been talking about, number one. Number two, I tell them, don't assign anybody to Ibogaine treatment until you've done it yourself. I mean, I have. It's not for the faint-hearted. It's a tough experience in many ways. In fact, I would say that of all the psychedelics, it's the toughest one to go through. Number two, that's the second point. The third point is you have to be really trained in it so that it's not without potential harm. And people undergoing Ibogaine treatment, depending on what kind of doses they get, they need to be monitored for their cardiac function and so on, and they need to be screened for it. So it needs to be used in a very safe and controlled environment. So those are my 3 points. Understand its potential. Do it yourself. Don't suggest it to somebody without doing it yourself. At least don't try to administer it to anybody without doing it yourself. You can suggest it, but don't do it yourself. Don't administer it yourself. And number 3, be aware of the physiological concerns. Those would be my 3 points. And beyond that, I can tell you, if a pharmaceutical company came out with a substance that would obviate opiate withdrawal, in let's say only 25% of people, that'd be a huge breakthrough. Well, Ibogaine will do it a good 50, 60% of the time. And probably you could do better if you provided better contexts. So it's just an enormous potential. And it's beyond comprehension why it isn't researched more, why the US government hasn't embraced it, in fact, forbids it. I mean, you'd have to get almost cynical about explaining why it's like that, because on any rational or humanitarian grounds, there's no excuse for this presence, obtuseness around it.
And it's hard not to be cynical about this topic after what we've seen in the news over the last few years with Purdue Pharma and other organizations being exposed for over-marketing, misleading, the risks of a substance like Oxycontin. And I once heard, our chief medical officer at Beond, Dr. Jeffrey Camlett, say that an addict that seeks treatment with Ibogaine and receives it successfully oftentimes wants to become a provider.
Absolutely.
And I think there's something interesting there about the person's willingness to help, their desire to go from an addict, a chronic user, someone who's suffering or avoiding suffering using, to wanting to help. Is there something that you experienced in your own experience of Ibogaine which was similar? Did it sort of awaken?
I don't think that's specific to Ibogaine, actually. When I was in medical practice working with this highly addicted population, I can't tell you how many times a client of mine would say to me, "Doc, if I ever beat this, I'm going to spend the rest of my life working to make sure that nobody else has to suffer like I did." In other words, there's something with the nature of healing itself that invites a desire to heal others, to help others heal. So Ibogaine does that in a big way, but it's not unique to Ibogaine. But 2 weeks ago, I was at a conference in San Diego on psychedelic healing, along with some other speakers, and I invited on stage a veteran, a Navy SEAL veteran, severe PTSD. His personal life was just in ruins. and he did the Ibogaine, turned out just like that. And now he's working to bring this modality to other veterans. So what you're describing here is, I think it's the nature of healing. Mm-hmm. And more dramatic the healing is, the more committed or the more enthusiastic that person becomes to bring that same healing to others.
I agree a lot. First of all, in our attendees is Dr. Lynette Averill, who has done extensive work on trauma and specializes in trauma, suicidality, and treatment with Ibogaine. Dr. Jeffrey Camlett, our chief medical officer, who has decades of experience, meticulously preparing people and mitigating the risks that you refer to related to the use of Ibogaine. It can be done particularly well and carefully, both for trauma and for addiction relief. One of the things that we've found is a lot of the coaches, a lot of the therapists have had some experience in Ibogaine and healing, and are particularly good at preparation or the procedure, or most importantly, the aftercare. Can you talk a little bit about that bridge, that care continuum as it relates to this type of experience?
Well, so again, I've worked with a range of psychedelics, and what happens, well, Sigmund Freud once said that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. Well, actually, I would add, well, so are psychedelics. In fact, in a sense, they're more powerful roads to the unconscious because dreams are so damn difficult to interpret. And Freud's interpretation of dreams, I think, was often ridiculous. But he was onto something. And so in a psychedelic state, just as in the dream state, there's a veil between our unconscious, the store of unconscious memories and emotions, and our awareness. And that, in fact, not a veil, sometimes a cement block, because it was so painful that we had to erect this defense against it. Well, what psychedelics do, and Ibogaine certainly does very powerfully, is to lift that veil. So all of a sudden you are with everything you've been running away from all your life. So you have that vision, and you're doing so now no longer as a helpless child, but as an empowered adult. But just because you had a glimpse and that experience, it doesn't mean you've integrated the lesson into your life. The integration takes place over time. So what we call aftercare, or the integration phase, is about how to bring that awareness and how to maintain that awareness in our daily lives without the use of psychedelics. Because unlike Prozac, Ibogaine is not meant to be taken every day. It's not there to just change your brain temporarily, and it's there to actually take you beyond your previous level of awareness of what was inside you. Well, that has to be maintained. So 2 days ago, I participated in a very powerful psychedelic experience with some Indigenous people here in Canada, and it was big for me. I'm still learning, and but I know that I have to work to put that into my life every day. So it has to be practices that'll keep it sacred. There'll have to be daily awareness. I'll have to communicate about it. I'll have to talk to people about it. Maybe I'll have to journal. So that's the job of integration, is to make it a part of, so that it doesn't just remain an interesting memory, but it actually becomes a presence in your life. And that demands work. And that work is the work of integration. And this is where therapists and coaches and counselors, physicians can play a big role in supporting people's integration.
Agreed. we've spent a lot of time thinking about those skill developments, those what we call healing experiences that build on the outcome of the Ibogaine procedure, which itself builds on the preparation of mind, body, spirit to ensure that it's as effective and as profound as you describe at getting at those core root traumas that cause the addiction.
That's right.
When we think a little bit about, again, that the scope and the opportunity for both the education or training of this whole new, not necessarily generation, but wave of therapists and care providers after they have the Ibogaine and Ibogaine experience themselves. Is there something particular about that aftercare that you see as uniquely relevant? Is it better to utilize those activities, those contemplative, meditative approaches, whether we use telemedicine extensively so that we can allow people to interact with group and therapists and one-on-one. Do you have thoughts on the best kind of environment for that to occur?
Well, this is maybe self-evident to say, but the best, in fact, the essential environment is one of safety. So when people are safe, different brain functions are enlivened and empowered. So for people to integrate any awareness, they really have to feel safe. So you need to provide that safety. So how to provide safety as a therapist or as a counselor is when I train counselors, therapists in my own particular modality called compassionate inquiry, it begins with knowing yourself enough to be aware of how you're showing up for that client. It's not what you do with the client. Well, that's important too. But first, how am I showing up? So you got to keep working on yourself. That's the first point. And notice. See, as soon as I have an agenda for a client, even if it's the right agenda, I'm no longer safe for them. Because it means I want them to be somewhere else other than where they are. They get that energetically. So it's important to keep working on yourself, okay? And to provide that safety. The second point is that you got to go, and I suppose if people are in this workshop right now, they're already gone beyond the Western cleavage of mind and body and spirit. You talked about mind, body, and spirit a moment ago. That's not how medicine looks at anything. Western medicine looks at it body. Body. Not even body, but body part. So you really have to have an integrated perspective of mind, body, and spirit. In other words, what do you have to do? We have to learn from the Indigenous people that developed these modalities in the first place. When I spent 3 days now with some Indigenous people here in British Columbia, I was just awed by their consciousness of the unity of everything, by their palpable, non-metaphorical connection to nature, for example, to plants, to water, to everything. Now, the more we can ourselves ground ourselves in that unitary perspective, which incidentally is not just fascinating, esoteric, Indigenous experience, it also has to be totally scientifically accurate. I mean, this is the funny thing is we keep priding ourselves on our science, but in fact, we ignore all kinds of science. Because the real science shows it's all one, isn't it? That's not just sort of some spiritual ideal. It's actually reality. So do the work on yourself and come from arrive at a unitary perspective. Those are the two things that come up for me immediately.
We have.
Sorry, and one more thing.
Yes, sir.
That just occurs to me. You can't do this work successfully as long as you're afraid of your own pain, or of pain in general. I mean, there's so much trauma in the world. These people that I talked with, these indigenous people, they carry so much sadness, so much pain. They've suffered so much, and they continue to. You have to be ready to face that pain and to be with it and not be daunted by it.
Agreed. Which you mentioned that unification, that sense of oneness with nature, that overwhelming sense of a non-duality, being a part of something bigger, which is oftentimes precisely the representation of someone who has gotten clean or become free from addiction.
That's right.
There's it seems to me, a similar concept there of now I'm able to be connected with something bigger than me, a sense of purpose, a community, a sense of love, the very things that the attendees were describing that were missing.
That's right. That's right. I can only agree with that. I have nothing to add to it. I agree. Yeah.
Well, I want to build on that if that's okay, because I think this is, and you mentioned the connection to science. It's our hope at Beond that by integrating these, the modern medical expertise, the technology to keep you safe with plants, the plant medicine, the psychedelic experience, we begin to bridge that divide from either science or nature, but one. And I think that what I'm keep coming back to is, and why we're doing this series until August, every 2 weeks, is this isn't what's taught. This isn't what is, you're either a healer or a doctor or a shaman or a therapist, but you can't be one. You can't actually have the spirit and the mind and the body, or body parts as you describe them, with the expectation that the plant or the psychedelic experience of Ibogaine that comes from Iboga will help unify that, will help expose what needs to be brought together.
Yeah. Well, what you're saying, Tom, is blessedly more and more understood by more and more people. And that's, I talked to Michael Pollan, who wrote How to Change Your Mind. And I asked him, was he surprised by the reception to his book? And he said he was particularly surprised by the reception from the medical community, because he expected a lot of resistance. And what he got instead was a lot of curiosity, a lot of openness. And that's because he says, and of course you and I agree with him, that the medical toolkit is pretty thin when it comes to really helping people with their deep issues. So more and more physicians are realizing that. More and more non-physician healers are recognizing that. The institutions are beginning to study it, do research. But you know what? Here's the thing. I'm going to say something heretical here, perhaps. I don't care if there's one more bit of research done. I already know this stuff works. So that what's holding us back is not research at this point. It's not lack of available evidence. It's not lack of evidence of our own eyes. It's just fear and prejudice. And institutionally, institutions harbor a lot of fear and a lot of prejudice. So on the one hand, we have this popular movement that's really burgeoning. You wouldn't have imagined this same webinar 10, 15 years ago. But so that's happening. And at the same time, there's still a lot of resistance.
Agreed. We're very pleased with the number of doctors that are both graduates of medical school, board certified in addiction medicine, trained in the skills they need to identify disease or mitigate risk who are interested in this, what we think of as a sacred technology, whether it's Dr. Kamlet, Dr. Malakara. There's a whole new generation of doctors that are approaching us. We have a residency program specifically designed for this, where doctors, therapists, psychologists can train with our doctors to observe, to have workshops like this, but on site to discuss what am I looking at, how can I improve upon the client experience, the patient experience, to increase the efficacy of the Ibogaine for the treatment of trauma and addiction. I think the evidence is there in many cases from the personal experience like you described. People are doing psychedelics, then they're going to medical school, then they're getting their license.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm back now. Thank you. Yes, that's happening in a big way, and I'm really glad it's happening. I'm not sure that you asked me a question there. You said something that I totally agree with again, so I don't need to say much more about that.
Well, it's not a question, it's a discussion about advancing the skill set and the technology and integrating with the vision of plants with science versus, as opposed to the alternative psychedelic assisted.
Which reminds me of that question I have for you. So I appreciate you focus on Ibogaine, and I get it. It's a very important modality. But are you focusing only on Ibogaine, or are you including the other modalities as well in your training?
Well, yes, we are. We are focusing on Ibogaine because of the precise reasons that you point out about its capabilities of arresting the withdrawals, rapidly facilitating the detox for the person who otherwise is unlikely to endure conventional treatment.
So you mean an opiate addict?
An opiate addict. It could be an alcohol use disorder client. It could be crystal meth. It could be other stimulants like cocaine or other substances. We're focused there now because that seems to be where the crisis that is most adversely impacting individuals, families, and communities. Of course, we're expanding with other modalities, other medicines, as we are able, as quickly as we can. The doctors demand it, the clients demand it.
Yeah, great.
So I'm going to go here and look specifically for some questions from folks that are excited to hear from you. Could you touch, once again, maybe go a little bit more detail of your personal experience of Ibogaine? I know that you're pretty open about your own journey and transformation. Yeah. I'd love to hear, there's some questions specifically about that.
Yeah, so I think I've done Ibogaine 3 times. Mm-hmm. I didn't need to use it for opiate withdrawal because I've never been an opiate addict. So the first time I did it was just for depression, actually. I was in a depressed state, and it was suggested to me that this could help me. So I went through it. Again, it's not for the faint-hearted. I literally couldn't stand up, couldn't go to the bathroom by myself for about 8 hours. And I had some pretty difficult physical states to go through. And when I came out of it, my depression was gone. And it lasted precisely 3 months, which is what they told me, that's as long as it'll last in your system. And almost with clock-like accuracy, I noticed my depression coming back after 3 months. And that's because I did not do any integration. And nobody there to offer me integration. But the change both ways was quite remarkable. That was my first experience. It lasted a good 24 hours at least. And it was another day or so before I came out of it. And I needed a lot of support, and I received it, but there was no integration afterwards. Then I did it 2 more times. And again, it was very difficult. And it didn't do much for me the last time. And I can tell you, looking back, I can tell you exactly why it didn't do much for me. Because the life I was leading was crazy. I was a workaholic, taking on way too much. And you can't take water out of a boat while there's a big hole at the bottom of the boat where the water keeps coming in. And so that if I want to commit to healing, I need to commit not just to Iboga, I need to commit to healing. In which case, the Iboga is a helper, but I need to help myself as well. So that's another good point for you, is that for people that want this kind of healing, they have to look at their whole lives and how they're living their life. And does the life itself support healing? Because if the life itself doesn't support healing, the Iboga can only do so much. And so that's why I said when I had this experience 2 days ago now, boy, am I committed to bring it into my life. I'm really committed this time. That I'd say is my experience with it. Now, having said that, I've also seen lots of people come out of opiate addiction with Iboga. I've witnessed it. It's quite wondrous to behold. Imagine somebody 20 years on heroin, then in Iboga, and there's no withdrawal, and their whole life changes. I mean,
why we exist.
It's the wet dream of any physician, you know.
I'm not sure I know what you mean there, but it's
a fond. I meant it's a fond dream of any physician to have that kind of success.
It really is, and it's so fast. When done properly, it's so predictable.
Yeah.
When built around, when used with a container, if you will, of preparation, so that the client goes into the psychedelic experience with Ibogaine prepared, with very little fear, if any, knowing what to expect and what their intention is. Of course, that's true for every psychedelic. It can be done, but you yourself described this as being very intense and having a specific intention, surrounded by the aftercare, the ability to have group with people who have done Ibogaine and were addicts or were trauma patients, makes it even more of a profoundly beneficial experience that many are seeking to provide.
Absolutely.
One of the things I'd love to talk about is conventional treatment methods, just going back a little bit. So, of course, we know the institutions are resistant.
Yeah.
But why doesn't it work? Why are the statistical levels of success of conventional drug and alcohol treatment centers? What's happening there? Why isn't it?
Because they're not addressing the fundamental issues. They're addressing, as I said earlier, the symptoms. They're addressing the surface manifestations, but not I've talked to so many people who've been addicted to all manner of substances. And when I start to ask them about their lives and their pain, they say, nobody's ever asked me this before. And I've been to dozens of providers, psychologists and doctors over the addiction specialists. Nobody ever asked them what happened to them in life, how they feel about themselves as human beings, what their beliefs are about themselves and the world. These questions don't get asked. Well, I can't be categorical about it. I'm sure in some places they are, but overall they're not. And it's all the rapid treatments and behavior therapies. There's even this phrase called behavioral medicine. Now I'm going to ask you, what the hell is behavioral medicine? Behaviors are nothing but symptoms. Even the word behavior or medicine tells us the shallowness of an approach. It's not about behavioral medicine, it's about human medicine. Behaviors are manifestations of human psychological dynamics. Are we going to address that, or are we going to just address the behavior? So the emphasis is on changing the behavior, but not in transforming the individual. So it's symptom control rather than transformation. And that's why the conventional treatments, expensive, repeated failures.
Expensive, repeated failures, and they take a long time. We're talking about months at a time. We're talking about a very, very ineffective tool for the scope and scale of the problem, it seems.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. Like if you had a car and you took it to a mechanic and they fixed it, and a week later it broke down again. So you took it back and they fixed it again and it broke down again. Would you keep going back to the same mechanic? You might ask yourself, you might ask yourself, does this person really understand my car?
Maybe if insurance covered it.
Yeah, I suppose.
Part of the economic incentive is, I think, that you mentioned. It's hard to not be cynical. So, what can we do, I think, to prepare the client specifically, besides advising them to be ready for the intensity of the experience? What can we do from a psychological perspective as a therapeutic practitioner to prepare them for such a rapid transition from a practice of chronic addiction that's essentially, as you described, going to be a recent memory in about 12 to 24 hours. It seems like that's a huge change in a very short period of time. But if we just focus on preparing, you're going to miss your medicine. How do we help the clients be prepared for what they're about to encounter from a psychological perspective?
Okay, so first of all, I'd really want to know that this person is committed and motivated, that they're not doing this because somebody else told them it was good. They're not doing it because they're trying to please anybody else. I want to know that that motivation is intrinsic. That's the first thing, because if it is, that'll see them through the difficulty of the experience. Number one. Number two, if it's me, I go through that questioning that I did with the whole group in the beginning. What is the addiction? What has it done for you? And how did you lose those qualities in your life? In other words, I do some preparation for anticipating the trauma imprints that are going to arise. And I would tell them that some of that pain that you've been running away from through your addiction may arise for you during that experience, but in a good way, in a way that you can actually witness as an adult, and in a way that you'll receive support for, which if you had received in the first place, you wouldn't have been traumatized. But I prepared them for that experience. I would tell them some of what it might physically feel like, that they might not sleep for 24 hours, that they might experience some discomfort. I'll also prepare them by saying, you might also experience some pretty amazing visions and insights. In other words, I prepare them to expect the unexpected. And above all, going back to what I said about safety, conveying that sense of safety that you really are in good hands. And that whatever happens, there's support there for you.
Well, we share that vision by not only having as many doctors that are trained properly and psychologists and nurses who are trained properly, but experienced with this particular medicine specifically. Yeah. But I also think that the willingness to engage in a holistic, additional adjunct therapies, whether it's movement or exploration, or as you put it, nature, integration with nature in the moment after the Ibogaine treatment, we found is so important because we're resetting those patterns. Those are you mentioned that Ibogaine stayed within your system for a period afterwards, clockwork, 3 months, I think you said. Yeah. That for us is the period of time when we're able to help those people jumpstart the life post acute withdrawal, post the procedure.
When you mentioned nature, 2 days ago was when I was in this experience, which by the way was with psilocybin, fairly high dose psilocybin. It was in a dark room. We're all on our mats in this dark room, me and these Indigenous brothers and sisters. And at some point, one of the helpers came to me and said, "I'm going to take you outside." And this happened on this Indigenous land with this beautiful mountain facing us, with bison in the field. And my God, the sense of unity and peace and beauty that I experienced. Well, the same thing with Ibogaine, same thing with ayahuasca, actually. So that nature is huge because nature itself is integrated like we're not. We could be, but we're not. So by connecting with nature, that promotes our own integration, emotional and psychic integration. And we also get to really experience what you were talking about before, which is that we really, really are a part of something much greater than this little bag of skin and bones.
We agreed. We try to start that long before there's a discussion about any procedure. We're using a plant.
Yes.
We're welcoming the plant and it to do it help do its work that we have to do, the client and therapists have to do. But we recognize that the plant is obviously, but sometimes overlooked, part of nature. It is part of the same natural environment from which we should feel like we come.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, because of the challenges with agriculture, regenerative agriculture in particular, and sourcing Ibogaine, we really did make a decision to invest in and support programs in the places from which the medicine comes through nonprofits that are directly anti-imperialist, anti-racist, anti-misogynist, so that we hopefully are able to bring the energy of the healing development work that we're hoping to support on the ground, Indigenous-led local work that yields the medicine we're using all the way through the entire supply chain. So we're healing one with the substance that we hope is healing many.
Yeah.
What were you going to say? I apologize.
I already forgot. Couldn't have been that important.
Oh, okay. I have a question about the stigma of addiction, the stigma of psychedelics, and the stigma of the use of psychedelic technologies in a therapeutic context. Do you see any relationship here where people are afraid to admit, afraid that that they're open, or talk about the role of stigma to keep us trapped in this cycle at every juncture, the addict or the trauma.
So to some extent, the stigma is completely understandable for two reasons. One is that if you trace the history of psychedelics, there's been a lot of misuse of them, where advocates were quite loose about promoting the use of them without the proper context. And people got hurt. And that happened a lot in the 60s, actually. Number one. Number two, people who are substance addicted particularly might really have a difficult time wrapping their minds around that I was substance addicted and now you're suggesting I do another substance. So particularly the 12-step movement, people have a hard time understanding this, which is interesting because Dr. Bill W., one of the founders of AA himself, did a lot of healing with LSD. But they don't talk much about that in the 12-step movement. And by the way, he was a traumatized child, of course. But partly it's just based on this sort of logical but incorrect link people make. Well, if I was addicted to a substance, now I want me to do another substance. Number three, there's been a lot of demonizing of psychedelics in the culture and on the part of politicians and so on. So I think how we deal with that is that we say, yes, psychedelics have been misused, and it's like anything else. It can be misused. It's that like Walt Disney cartoon, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, where Mickey Mouse is the assistant to the sorcerer, but he doesn't have the power and the skill to handle the sorcerer's tools. And when he tries to, he creates total chaos. There's that phenomenon. Excuse me. But what we say to people is, and this is, I'm sure, something that you emphasize a lot, is set and setting. Set is the mindset. So when I use alcohol to numb myself, my mindset is to escape from myself. When I use psychedelics in the proper setting, my intention is actually very holy, and holy literally in the biblical sense. Abraham, the mythical founder of monotheism, was told by God in Hebrew, Lech lecha, go to yourself. So in psychedelic use, you're trying to go to yourself, not away from yourself. That's already very different than the addictive use. The addictive use, as we saw in those first comments, is all about getting away from yourself. Psychedelic use is about really getting to your true self. That's the set, that's the mindset. And that changes everything. And then there's the setting, which is that the setting is people who are committed to your health. And they're committed to support you in an environment that's designed to support you and to keep you safe. So that it is meaningless to talk about substances non-specifically as if it's all the same. It's not all the same. It depends very much on the set and the setting. And that totally changes things. So that's how I would speak about it. So I would understand. And if somebody comes from a place of sort of a stigmatized understanding, I would acknowledge that. I would acknowledge, yeah, you might have some good reasons for seeing it that way. But here's maybe what you don't understand. That's how I would approach them.
Yes, the mindset and the setting.
Yeah.
Community, the mindset of the community and the setting is what I think you're getting at. And we have spent a great deal of time thinking precisely about both what's comfort, what's the benefit of comfort, what's the benefit of feeling safe, being able to educate someone and prove that we anticipate their question about safety, but also the mindset preparation for Ibogaine, for addiction and treatment for addiction and trauma starts long before any administration of a substance.
Yeah.
And it is the first step to the integration. That should not be it should not be interrupted It should be very seamless continuum. Let's talk a little bit about the family, though. So now we have let's say hypothetically, a opiate addict who's been using. The family is traumatized by this experience, perhaps. They're not traumatized by the experience?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. They're struggling is what I mean to say. They're struggling.
Well, that's different. Here's where we have to make a real distinction. They're experiencing pain. They're experiencing despair. They're experiencing sorrow. They might be experiencing grief. They might be experiencing a lot of rage and anger. That's not necessarily trauma. Trauma is not difficult feelings. Trauma is a wound that constricts you. So people are having pain, despair. They're not necessarily traumatized. Trauma is not those emotions. Trauma is when those emotions get stuck inside you and they dominate your behavior. So that's the first point. The second point is, so in my book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, which is my book on addiction, there's a chapter for families and caregivers. The first point they need to understand is that, let me tell you something about, there's a fellow called Luis Malmadrona. I'm just looking for his book, but I don't want to leave the screen to pick it. He's a Lakota physician and psychiatrist, part Lakota. And I interviewed him for my next book. And Luis told me, he's an author. He wrote a book called Coyote Medicine, amongst other books. And he told me that in the Lakota tradition, when somebody gets sick, the whole community gathers and says, thank you. You are manifesting a process that represents what's happening in the community. You're just the sensitive ones who's embodying it. So you're taking on our suffering, really. And so our job is to support your healing, because that supports our own. So not only is that a beautiful spiritual tradition, it also has to be scientifically correct. So that person's addiction represents the family's multi-generational trauma. That person downloaded that trauma. Why that person? Well, that's all kinds of reasons for it, but one of them might be that he's the most sensitive ones in a family. So he's the one that picks up on all the family pain that the others might not even feel. So I'd say to these people, if you want to understand the addict, you got to understand the family system, which means that not only does the addict need healing, the identified addict, I should say, but the whole family could use some healing here. Number one. Number two, there's 3 attitudes you could take. I'm saying this to the families. 2 of them are healthy. The third one is insane. The healthy ones are, your pain and your behavior, I can't handle it. It's too painful for me. That's not your fault. I just can't deal with it. So I can't be around it. So I'm going to withdraw, not to punish you, but to protect myself. That's reasonable, you know? The second sane attitude is, I get that your addiction is your attempt to escape from pain. And as long as you need to do it that way, it's your path, it's not mine. So I'm going to be with you. I can't change it. But I'm going to be available to you. That's totally sane as well. What is insane is, I'm going to be in your life. I'm going to keep working on changing you and pushing you to change. Now that never works. So that just creates more resistance. So in a nutshell, I'm saying families have a decision to make. First of all, are they willing to look at the larger system and see what the origin is of that individual's pain might be? And are they willing to undertake the task of healing themselves, regardless of whether the person takes on the task of healing? Not for them, but for themselves. And secondly, are they willing to accept the person exactly where they're at this moment, without demanding that they be any different? So that's what I would say to families.
Very tough for some people to embrace, which is why we choose to use telemedicine, to choose to use the technology available. Can't get everyone to a facility for Family Day, but what we can do is engage in extended aftercare. And as that client develops and those relationships are open to change potentially, that's when the conversation.
Yeah, and what is, to go back to the original statement that they're traumatized. Most of the time, I don't believe they're actually traumatized. What's actually happening is their own hidden trauma gets triggered. And they believe it's caused by the addict, but it isn't. It's caused by something in themselves.
Agreed. We had a question that I think came up a couple of times, and I just want to bring it up because I think we're coming to a close here, run out of time. Want to give you a chance to tell us a little bit more about the myth of normal. But before we do, can we talk a little bit more about the relationship or even the integration of psychedelic assisted therapies with the proper set and setting and a traditional or what's considered to be a conventional 12-step program? We see them working together.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us a little bit about why that works. And
so first of all, if I just simply look at the 12 steps themselves, they are brilliant. They're shining light. Anybody, whether they have an addiction to alcohol or substances or not, who couldn't use the 12 steps? Recognizing the limitations of the ego, the powerlessness of the ego in the face of the unconscious forces of pain that animate so much of our behavior. Seeking a higher power, which is our conscience, our connection to nature, God, if you want to call it that. In other words, seeing ourselves part of a much larger whole, looking at in clear detail how we've lived our lives, and how we've lived our lives may have hurt others along the way. Continuing to do that inventory, connecting with others with the intention of helping them to the extent that they're open to that without imposing our views on them. Well, these steps are beautiful for anybody. So why shouldn't they be congruent with psychedelic assisted therapy and integration? The only problem comes in is when not the 12 steps, but the 12-step movement, people in it have trouble understanding what the psychedelics are all about. If they understood all, and I think this goes back to the 12-step, the limitations of the 12-step movement, which is, again, it's not universal because it depends which group, where, and at what time. But by and large, when I've talked to people who have been to the 12 steps, they have not had much understanding of trauma. They see this disease model. I was born an alcoholic. Nobody's born an alcoholic. So they don't see the trauma. So I think what's missing from the 12-step, institutionally speaking, is an understanding of trauma. If that was in there, and if they're willing to embrace that, the 12 steps themselves are powerful supports for the healing process.
Agreed. Thank you. I can't help but ask this question or ask you to remind us or go back into more detail. You're on stage, you're talking about psychedelics, and you bring a Navy, I think you said a Navy SEAL or a veteran up.
Yeah. This
is trauma that most of us probably have a hard time imagining what that's really like.
Yeah.
Really. I mean, and when we think about Ibogaine assisted therapy and the acceleration of the relief of someone who is suffering so much.
Yeah.
Is there something particular about the therapeutic, the psychedelic assisted therapy with Ibogaine for a trauma patient as opposed to an addict or a substance use disorder patient that has to be really better looked at, understood by the therapist? Because clearly detox isn't there. There may be a whole host of other issues.
Well, look, I think if you're dealing with a person with trauma, but not with an opiate addiction, then you have an even greater possibilities, because now you don't have to deal with this terrible physiological part of it. Mm-hmm. And quite apart from its impact on opiate addiction that you and I have celebrated here, mm-hmm. It's just the Ibogaine experience is a powerful trauma teaching and healing experience.
I like that. A teaching and healing experience, which is precisely what we're aiming for at Beond, what we're aiming for in this speakers series, what we'll be aiming for in each of these sessions every 2 weeks through August. And probably a good opportunity for you to tell us more about the myth of normal and the toxic culture that you're describing. Why another book? Why now?
Let me leap up for a moment. Okay, I'll be right back.
Okay. Great time for anybody with last question.
So this is the galley copy. It's not the printed copy of the book yet. That doesn't come out till September. But this is what it's going to look like. The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. And what I'm saying is that what is considered to be normal in this society is actually completely abnormal from the point of view of human needs. This idea of human beings as aggressive, competitive, selfish individuals, the institutions that feed that propaganda, the companies that meet people's false needs because their real needs aren't being met. The understanding of the medical misunderstanding or lack of appreciation for the mind-body unity that you and I have talked about. These are the norm in this society. But norm, in a dysfunctional context, is by definition abnormal. And I'm saying that the illnesses that people develop, the autoimmune diseases, the addictions, the mental health conditions, these are normal responses to abnormal circumstances. So the abnormality is not in the illness, which is a normal response. I mean, if I was growing organisms in a laboratory culture, we call it, and many of these organisms were dying or developing illness on a large scale, we would say this is a toxic culture. Now, given that something like 70% of Americans, adults, are at least on one medication for something or another, if we understand that these illnesses are a response to a certain environment, emotional, physical environment, then we have to say this is a toxic environment. And to believe that this is normal is to turn the idea of normality on its head. So in this book, I discuss mental illness, I discuss addictions, I discuss physical illness, all from this perspective. I discuss the social conditions that feed that abnormality, the misogyny, the distorted relationship between masculinity and femininity, between people, but also within people. The corporations that batten off it, the politics that feed it, the childhood practices that entrench abnormality as normal. We're not meeting kids' needs, and then we wonder why they turn out to have ADHD or this or that disorder. And I point some pathways of healing as well. So it's a big project I took on. I can't even believe I finished it. Believe me, I suffered. I'm not being self-pitying. I'm just telling you I suffered. And at times I felt I wasn't adequate to it. But you know what? I'm very happy with it. And I think it's going to make a difference for a lot of people.
We are so, I am so excited about it. And you know that when we first met, we first talked, I expressed the commitment of all of our therapists, all of our team have been briefed in and will engage in the methodology of compassionate inquiry because we believe in it, practice it. But I think these are the types of materials that we can bring into a healing library. At Beond, we have a healing library for guests, for staff. Look, people can take the book home with them, and we plan to have plenty of copies of this book and others.
Great.
Want to thank you. We're a little over time. It's been a wonderful, wonderful webinar and discussion. We will continue these. We would love to have you back either as a guest or a panelist. I know how busy you are, but next week we're specifically, or in 2 weeks on April 6th, specifically talking more detail about the science of Ibogaine. How does it actually work in the brain with greater detail? We've got.
Well, if you would be kind enough to send me a link to that, I can't promise to be there because I am really booked up, but if I have time, I would love to drop in. Anyway, look, and I want to thank you. It's been really a rich discussion with you, and I've enjoyed it so much. So thank you.
As always, Dr. Gabor Maté, thank you very much for participating in Beond's Ibogaine Insights. Thanks very much to all of our hundreds of attendees and for your team for making this possible.
Thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.